So we moved from the Mishnah of Nazir to the Mishnah of Sota, but actually we're still in the same parsha. We're still in the parsha of Nassau at the beginning of Bamidbar, at the beginning of the book of Numbers. And fascinatingly, the parsha of Nassau speaks first of all about the, let's say, taking up and putting down the erection or on the de-erection of the Mishkan. And then it talks about the Sota. We'll learn in a minute what a Sota is. And then it describes the halakha of the Nazir, the person that doesn't shave and doesn't come into contact with the dead and doesn't drink wine, and then moves on to the priestly blessing. And we do the Midrash does wonder whether it might not be some connection between these three, that we know that the priests can't give their blessing when if they're intoxicated. And of course, you know that the Mishnah, the Midrash is anxious that wine can lead to sexual immorality. So they're anxious about the connection between wine and sex. So maybe the advice to the Nazir not to drink wine, maybe that's a common thread that links the Sota and the priestly blessing. I'm not sure. But anyway, these are all articulated in the Parsha of Nassau. And we've asked before, why should all these different subjects be brought together in the Seder, in the order of Nashim? And it's interesting that they do fall together in Torah, and they are certainly all brought together by issues related to language. As we go through the Mishnah of Sota, we'll see that language is absolutely critical running through the tractate. Of course, the test of the Sota is going to be drinking some water in which language has been erased and buried. And then towards the end of the tractate, we get into discussions about what type of speech has to be made in Hebrew, and what kind of speech can be made in any tongue. So, for example, does the tefillah need to be said in Hebrew, or could it be said in any language? And towards the end of the tractate, the Mishnah goes through all kinds of different speeches, including, by the way, the speech which the Mashuach HaMilchama, the priest who's anointed for war, including the speech that's made to the troops before going out to war, and discusses, it discusses what language these speeches need to be made in, but also just gives us different types of. We also learn effectively the laws of war from this tractate. So it's a very interesting tractate for all kinds of reasons. It jumps off in the Parsha of Nassau from a man who's jealous of his wife. Ve'avar alav ruach kina. The husband has a ruach kina, has a spirit of jealousy. Kina is jealousy or zealotry in Hebrew. And the text goes on to say, "Ve'kinei et ishto," and he was jealous of his wife, or perhaps in this context, kinei should be translated as he warned his wife. And we'll see in the Mishnah that this verb, this root kina, kuf nun aleph, is translated as to warn. It's translated as to warn. Whether it means to be jealous or to warn, we're not quite sure. But the text in Chumash is, Ve'avar alav ruach kina, the spirit of jealousy, of kina, came upon him. Ve'kinei et ishto, and he was jealous, or he warned his wife. Ve'hi nitma'a, and she was defiled. And it sounds like she has had a sexual relationship with somebody else. Or, this is the other situation. The pasuk goes on to say, or avar alav ruach kina ve'kinei et ishto, or the spirit of jealousy came upon him and he warned his wife, ve'hi lo nitma, and she is not defiled. So she did not have a relationship with this other person. So we know that the spirit of jealousy is around, but the facts are not clear. Perhaps it was one thing, perhaps it was not. And the Psukim goes on to say that the man brings his wife to the Kohen and they bring an offering. It's a very plain offering. It's a meal offering. There's no oil. There's no frankincense, no levona. It's minchat kin'ah. It's a offering of jealousy. It's maskeret avon. It's a reminder of sin. Whose sin is it? Is it the husband or is it the wife? We're not quite sure. But the Mishnah is then going to explain the ceremony, which is actually explained in more detail in the remainder of the Pesukim. Now, the Mishnah, we're going to begin at the beginning of the Mishnah in chapter 1, but I just wanted to remind you, or to advance, I wanted to jump, if you like, by way of introduction, just to the 5th chapter, just for a second. The 5th chapter begins, Kashem shehamayim bodkin ota, kach hamayim bodkin oto. Just as the water checks her, so the water checks him. Because you'll all be thinking, I think we all think, as we read this tractate, which is focused on this poor woman, and we'll see that her treatment, we'll see that this is a degrading and this is a terrible ceremony for a woman to go through. We'll see that this tractate seems to be completely focused on the woman, and we might ask, well, what about the man? And so the Mishnah declares in chapter 5 that he is checked just as much as she is. And he, by the way, we'll see this Mishnah in its context a bit later. We'll see that the Mishnah here is talking about actually he, not so to speak, her husband, but he with whom she's accused of having a relationship, that he is checked just as much as she is checked. And the Rambam explains that the Mishnah, that in the Mishneh Torah, the Rambam explains, but that if she is guilty and if she dies, then he also will die. He also will die. But the Rambam goes on to say, because this is just relates to the possible adulterer, but there's another person involved here, which is the husband. And the Mishneh Torah goes on to say, all this is if her husband never ever engaged in forbidden sexual relationships in his life. But if he did ever engage in a forbidden relationship, the water doesn't check his wife, as we have explained. So and we learn later in the tractate, well after chapter 5, towards the end of the tractate, we learn actually that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi suspended the ceremony of the Sota because there were no husbands around. There were no husbands around who were considered free of sexual sin, and therefore it if you like, operating this process that checked the faithfulness of their wives was no longer of any purpose. So we read actually later in the Mishnah that in fact the process was suspended in the time of the Mishnah. Let's just jump into the beginning. That's just by way of short introduction. Let's just jump into the first Mishnah. Hamakanele ishto, Rabbi Eliezer omer makanela al pi shnayim umashke al pi erechad, or al pi atzmo. Someone who's jealous of his wife, Rabbi Eliezer says, makanela. Again, we have this root kuf nun hey. Is it that he's jealous of her? From context, it's he warns her, because the Mishnah says makanela al pi shnayim. He jealouses her, or he warns her on the testimony of two. We seem to be using the same word for jealousy that we are for warning. He warns her, he jealouses her on the evidence of two. So in other words, he has to give her a warning in front of two witnesses don't seclude yourself with this person. Umashka al pi eid echad. He makes a drink on the testimony of one or on his own testimony, i.e., if after this she has secluded herself with this person, then he can bring her to drink the bitter water. Rabbi Yoshua Omer, Mekanela al pishnaim, umashka al pishnaim. Rabbi Yoshua says this is just like any other normal legal process. Warning requires 2, and drinking requires 2. So it's a 2-stage process, according to Rabbi Yeshua. And by the way, the Rambam rules similarly in his commentary that 2 witnesses are required at each stage.